They called it Aegis, the first permanent human settlement on Mars, a symbol of progress, a promise that humanity could survive beyond Earth. It was a triumph, they said, a beacon of hope standing against the endless horizon of red dust and silence. The mission was clear: establish a colony, build a future, and prepare Mars for the generations to come. The world believed it. Billions watched as the first crew touched down, planted the flag, and declared the dawn of a new era. Official broadcasts showed smiling faces and pristine habitats sealed against the hostile Martian air. But that was 12 years ago. And 12 years ago, the broadcast stopped. The official statement was brief: a catastrophic failure, a sandstorm of unprecedented scale, communications lost, no survivors, no explanations, no further missions, no attempts to recover the bodies. The world moved on. Until now. This is Dr. Elena Kane, Sector 12. We've uncovered something. No, they're coming. If anyone hears this, that signal shouldn't exist. The channel it came through was shut down over a decade ago. Every log erased, every record sealed, and yet the message arrived, encrypted, fragmented, interrupted. What was uncovered in Sector 12? And why was it buried? What happened in the final moments before the colony went dark? For 12 years, NASA has denied the existence of this transmission. They've denied the colony's final distress call. They've denied the anomalies recorded in their own data streams. But denials can't erase the signal. And now the signal is out. We were told Mars was uninhabited, that life couldn't survive there, that humanity's arrival was the planet's first breath of life in billions of years. But what if that wasn't true? What if something was already there? What if the colony didn't die? What if it changed? Dr. Kane's voice was the first proof that the story we've been told isn't the whole story. It won't be the last. The year is 2042, 20 years since humanity made its first permanent mark on another world, Mars, the Red Planet, a name that once evoked dreams of exploration, expansion, and a future unbound by Earth's limits. The Aegis colony was meant to be the foundation of that dream. Built in stages, it started as a network of sealed habitats, domes of steel and glass rising out of the dust. Powered by nuclear reactors and solar fields, sustained by hydroponic farms and ice mining operations, it stood as a triumph of engineering. It was called humanity's greatest achievement, the first step toward transforming a barren planet into a second Earth. The media painted it as a success story, a thriving outpost filled with scientists, engineers, and pioneers who had left Earth behind to build something new. That was the official story. But whispers began almost immediately. Whispers about delayed transmissions, reports of sudden blackouts, messages that arrived garbled and incomplete, or didn't arrive at all. At first, NASA dismissed the rumors as technical glitches, problems with the deep space relays, minor setbacks easily corrected. They released edited footage of smiling colonists and growing crops, silencing doubts. But then, without warning, all communications stopped. One day the colony was there. The next, it was gone. NASA called it an accident, a massive sandstorm, unexpected and unstoppable. They claimed the domes collapsed, the life support systems failed, and every soul inside was lost. No recovery missions were launched. No wreckage was shown. No bodies were brought home. The story ended, neatly packaged and broadcasted across Earth. A tragedy, yes, but one that demanded no further questions. Not everyone believed it. My name is Elias Voss. Once, I was part of it. I worked inside the program, analyzing atmospheric data, measuring radiation patterns, monitoring the colony's environment. I saw the reports. I saw the anomalies. And I asked questions. That was my first mistake. My second was refusing to stop. I followed the data when no one else would. I traced patterns in the transmissions, patterns that didn't add up, messages that hinted at experiments beyond the scope of the mission, tests that weren't disclosed, structures that weren't supposed to exist. I found evidence that Mars wasn't as empty as we were told. And I tried to bring it forward. I sent encrypted files to journalists, lawmakers, anyone I thought would listen. But the story never reached the public. NASA denied everything. My access was revoked. My credentials were erased. My career gone overnight. And yet, the signals didn't stop. For years, faint echoes bounced through the void, fragments of voices, distorted and faint, repeating the same coordinates. Coordinates that led to Sector 12. That's where Elena Kane's last transmission came from. That's where she said they had uncovered something. And now, 12 years later, her voice has returned. I don't know how. I don't know why. But I know this: whatever happened at Aegis didn't die with the colony. And if the signal is real, if Elena Kane is still alive, then NASA has lied. I intend to find out why. The package arrived without a return address. No stamps. No markings. Just a plain, unmarked envelope sitting at the edge of my doorstep. At first, I thought it was junk. Another ad, another dead-end tip from someone claiming to have inside information about Mars. I'd gotten plenty of those over the years. People desperate to believe in conspiracies, scavenging for meaning where there was none. But this wasn't junk. The envelope was heavier than it looked. Inside, I found a small metallic case, sealed tight, with no markings except for a set of numbers etched into the surface: 12.04.30.22.17. Coordinates? Dates? I didn't know. What I did know was that the case wasn't standard. It wasn't commercial. It was government grade, hardened, encrypted, designed to survive almost anything short of total destruction. I forced it open. Inside was a data drive, black, unlabeled, military issue, the kind that wasn't supposed to leave secure facilities. Plugging it in felt like stepping off a cliff. Part of me wanted to stop, to walk away. But another part, the part that hadn't let go of Elena Kane's voice, the part that couldn't stop asking questions, pushed forward. The files came up slowly, layer by layer, hidden behind encryption protocols I hadn't seen in years. The system flagged them as classified. Level red. Restricted access. Unauthorized retrieval prohibited. And then they opened. Blueprints first. Diagrams of structures I didn't recognize. Cylindrical chambers buried deep beneath the surface, arranged in spirals, with conduits branching outward like roots. But these weren't the colony's living quarters. They weren't storage silos or research labs. They weren't part of the plans I'd seen before. The schematics were stamped with a name I'd only heard once, buried in the old logs I wasn't supposed to access. Black Horizon. It wasn't a colony sector. It wasn't a research station. It wasn't supposed to exist. I opened the next file. Scans. Biological data. Cell growth charts. Organism classifications. Unfamiliar, incomplete. Mutations logged in rapid succession. Changes measured in hours, not weeks. The samples were labeled G12. The same code used for the terraforming protocols under Project Genesis. Genesis, the last phase of the mission. The one designed to transform Mars into a habitable world. The experiment that was supposed to have ended before the first colonists even arrived. Officially, it had been shelved. Too risky. Too unpredictable. A failure. But the scans told a different story. Genesis hadn't been shut down. It had been activated. And then I found the video. At first, it was nothing but static, grainy and distorted, flickering like an old broadcast barely holding its signal. Then the image steadied. A figure in a spacesuit, stumbling through a dimly lit corridor. The walls behind them were slick, wet, reflective. Not metal. Not stone. Something else. Their breathing filled the feed, sharp, ragged, panicked. They turned, and I saw the name tag on their chest. Kane. Elena. Her voice broke through, low and frantic. They lied to us. This isn't what we signed up for. She kept moving, looking back over her shoulder. The sound of footsteps echoed, heavy, deliberate, but not hers. She stopped, pressed a hand to the wall, and leaned closer. No, she whispered. No, no, no. The feed cut out. No explanation. No time to react. Just blackness. For a long time, I couldn't move. Elena Kane. Alive. Or at least, she had been when this was recorded. The timestamp said 12 years ago, the day before the colony went silent. And the files? They weren't just evidence of failure. They were evidence of something much worse. Something NASA buried. Something they never expected anyone to find. I stared at the screen, replaying the last words Elena spoke. They lied to us? I didn't know what she meant. Not yet. But I was going to find out. The files on the drive weren't enough. They raised questions but left answers buried beneath layers of encryption and official silence. I needed more, proof that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. So I went to the only place that still held the truth. NASA's internal network wasn't built for public eyes. Its archives ran deep, layered with firewalls and redundancies designed to keep people like me out. But it wasn't impenetrable. I knew the system. I'd helped build parts of it, and they hadn't changed nearly as much as they thought. It took hours, longer than I expected. The security protocols had grown heavier since the colony's collapse. Multiple checkpoints, biometric locks, dynamic encryptions. Someone had made sure the data stayed buried. But buried doesn't mean lost. I broke through the outer layers first. Basic logs, maintenance reports, atmospheric data. The kind of files they released to the public to reinforce the official story. But beneath them, behind layers of security clearance, I found something else. The first file was a video log, timestamped 6 weeks before the blackout. It opened with shaky footage. A crew member's helmet camera, pointed at the surface outside the colony. The horizon stretched flat and empty, red sand and jagged rock. Normal. Then the view shifted. The camera panned down to a crevice in the ground, narrow, dark, and deep. Its walls weren't smooth. They were lined with patterns, grooves, shape, markings. The crew member spoke, their voice tight. It's not geological. It's structured. Symmetrical. The video cut to the interior of the crevice, floodlights revealing walls that gleamed wet, like polished glass. The patterns grew denser, forming grids, angles, designs that looked deliberate. And then something moved. It was quick, barely visible, a ripple through the shadows. The crew member cursed and stepped back. The video ended. I opened the next file. Biological scans. The images showed samples collected from the crevice, fragments of organic material. Not fossils. Living tissue. The notes described cell structures unlike anything found on Earth. Cells that regenerated, divided, adapted. Cells that changed their shape, their function, faster than should have been possible. The tests called it adaptive biomatter. But the notes stopped abruptly, mid-sentence. The next report picked up days later, but it wasn't a continuation. It was an incident log. Containment breach. Sector 12 sealed. No further access permitted. No explanation. No follow-up. I kept digging. The more I uncovered, the worse it got. Whistleblower reports buried deep in anonymous transcripts described terraforming failures, crop yields dying overnight, water sources turning acidic, oxygen levels fluctuating without warning. And then there were the disappearances. One log listed crew members missing in action. At first, 1 or 2 names, then entire teams. Officially, they were listed as casualties. Accidents during maintenance, exposure to Martian storms, equipment failures. But unofficially, the transcripts told a different story. Voices. Crew members speaking under anonymity, described hearing noises in sealed corridors. Scraping. Clicking. Something moving through the vent. Equipment failing without cause. Lights dimming and flickering even when the power grid was stable. Reports of colonists seeing shadows that shouldn't have been there. Shapes at the edges of their vision. One statement stood out. They look like us. I played the log 3 times, searching for context, but that was all it said. They look like us. The next whistleblower's report spoke of genetic experiments tied to Project Genesis. They described attempts to accelerate biological adaptation, merging synthetic DNA with Martian cells to create organisms that could survive the planet's harsh conditions. Terraforming wasn't enough. The planet resisted it. So they tried something else. They tried to force evolution, to design life that could thrive where humans couldn't. The experiment worked, but not the way they expected. The samples adapted too quickly, changing faster than the researchers could control. They stopped behaving like engineered life. They started behaving like predators. The colony was supposed to monitor the results, to test, observe, and report. But something changed. A transcript from a biologist detailed finding samples inside the colony itself, growths in the air vents spreading through the walls, samples that weren't supposed to leave the labs. The last entry ended with a single line. "It's learning." I shut the files. The drive had given me more than I expected, more than I wanted. The colony didn't collapse. It didn't fail. It was overrun. By what? I didn't know yet. But the reports, the footage, pointed to one thing. It wasn't just the environment NASA had tried to control. It was life itself. And it didn't stay in the lab. The deeper I went, the more the pieces began to fit together. The logs, the reports, the footage. It wasn't random. It wasn't chaos. It was calculated. NASA hadn't just studied Mars. They'd rewritten it. It started with Project Genesis, a program designed to bypass nature's timeline. Terraforming was too slow, too fragile. Mars fought back against every effort to reshape it. Winds eroded structures, soil rejected crops, and radiation broke down even the most durable materials. Genesis was supposed to change that. The plan was simple: seed Mars with engineered life. Synthetic cells, built from scratch, designed to survive where nothing else could. Self-replicating systems that could convert carbon dioxide, stabilize oxygen, and build organic networks to hold the soil in place. In theory, it would accelerate evolution by thousands of years. Mars wouldn't just be habitable, it would be alive. But theories are neat, clean, contained. What happened on Mars wasn't. The files detailed the first phase, introducing synthetic DNA sequences into microbial structures. The cells grew, multiplied, adapted. Faster than expected. Faster than anyone thought possible. It started small, biofilms forming on rocks, creeping across the surface. Harmless at first. Until they weren't. Phase 2 accelerated the process. Samples were merged with organic material harvested from Earth. Cells taken from plants, animals, even human tissue. The goal was to create hybrids, organisms that could bridge the gap between two worlds. The results weren't stable. The files documented mutations, patterns that defied prediction. Cells that divided too quickly, rewriting their own structures. Organisms that altered their forms to match environmental changes. And then something happened that the logs only hinted at. The hybrids stopped behaving like test subjects. They started behaving like systems. Networks of cells began to communicate, responding to signals, coordinating growth, replicating patterns. The logs called them biomorph, adaptive, reactive, self-aware. And that's when the colony changed. The reports shifted. The language grew vague. References to containment failures, structural breaches, unexplained malfunctions. But Elena's files filled the gaps. Her logs described the first encounters. Crew members reporting shadows in sealed corridors, tools missing from storage, systems recalibrating themselves without human input. At first, it was dismissed as paranoia, stress, isolation, the pressure of living in a closed system on a hostile planet. Until the first disappearance. A technician in Sector 9, last seen doing repairs outside the main habitat. His suit was recovered. Empty. No body. No signs of struggle. The logs called it an accident. Elena's notes didn't. She described seeing patterns in the sand, shapes that shifted when she looked away, as though the ground itself was moving. Then the patterns began appearing inside. On walls. On floors. In the wiring. The biomorphs weren't just growing, they were spreading. And then they started mimicking. Elena's logs documented it step by step. First, small imitations, shadows moving like human figures, echoes of voices in empty rooms. Then larger ones. Crew members reported seeing themselves, faces they recognized, movements that matched their own. But something was always wrong. A blink that lasted too long. A smile that didn't quite fit. A voice that carried a hollow echo. The biomorphs had learned to imitate. They didn't just adapt to the environment. They adapted to us. The final entries were the hardest to read. Elena described waking up to find her own voice coming through the comms, words she hadn't spoken, messages sent in her name. She described looking into the reflection of her own faceplate and seeing another set of eyes staring back. Not human, not alien, something in between. The last file wasn't a report. It wasn't a log. It was a recording. Elena speaking directly to the camera, her voice steady but strained. "They're not copies," she said. "Not clones. Not echoes. They're adaptations. They don't just mimic us, they learn from us. They improve." She leaned closer, her face filling the screen. "They're not testing survival. They're testing replacement." The recording cut out, but not before she spoke one last line. "They look like us now. But that's not the end." The files ended there. No explanation. No closure. But it was enough. The biomorphs weren't an accident. They weren't a failure. They were evolution, and they weren't finished. The last file wasn't like the others. It wasn't encrypted, fragmented, or incomplete. It was buried deeper, hidden under layers of corrupted data, but it was intact, almost like someone wanted it to be found. Not by the colony, not by NASA, but by whoever was left to listen. It was Elena's voice again. Clearer this time. Colder. Resigned. "This is Dr. Elena Kane. Sector 12. Final report." She didn't sound panicked anymore. Not like before. There was no rush in her words, no static cutting through her voice. "It's not what we thought," she said. "None of it." The recording jumped, skipping seconds at a time, stitched together from pieces. "We assumed it started with us. That Genesis was the beginning. That we were the first to touch this world and shape it. But the deeper we dug, the more we found." Her breathing slowed. It wasn't empty. The words hung there, deliberate, heavy, and absolute. "They told us we were the first." She paused. "They lied." The camera feed activated for the first time, grainy, flickering in shades of red and gray. It showed her standing in what looked like a cave, but the walls weren't stone. They were smooth, polished, carved with lines that intersected and spiraled outward in perfect symmetry. Patterns that looked biological, almost organic, but formed structures too precise to be natural. "We weren't the first to stand here," she said. The camera panned down, revealing something half buried beneath the dust. A shape. Curved. Metallic. Not human-made, but shaped by something deliberate. "We found ruins." The recording skipped again. "Not tools. Not relics. Bodies." The image shifted, and I saw them. Figures frozen in layers of rock, humanoid but wrong. Their limbs were too long, their joints angled in ways that didn't fit human anatomy. Their skulls were smooth, elongated, ridged like the surface of a seashell. "They weren't fossils," Elena said. "They weren't dead. Not completely." The camera zoomed in, and I saw it. One of the bodies, its chest cracked open, exposing something that pulsed faintly under layers of hardened tissue. "They adapted to survive," she continued. "They went dormant, waiting for the right conditions." The camera cut out, leaving only her voice. "And we woke them up." The next section of the recording was quieter. Slower. "They weren't just dormant. They were broken, fragmented at the cellular level. That's what Genesis did. We didn't create them. We repaired them." I paused the recording. Genesis hadn't been a terraforming project. It had been resurrection. The biomorphs weren't an accident. They weren't engineered. They were Martian. And NASA knew. The files didn't spell it out, but it was there, in the reports, the patterns, the timeline. The terraforming protocols were never meant to build a new ecosystem. They were designed to restore one. Elena's voice returned. Everything we built, they learned to mimic. Everything we thought we controlled, they adapted to overwrite. It was never about survival. It was about replacement. She exhaled slowly. And it started at the top. Her words hit harder than the footage. Leadership, she said. Command structure. The colony's core team. One by one, they changed. No warnings. No signs. They looked the same. Talked the same. But they weren't. Another pause. I tried to warn them. I tried to make them see. But how do you fight something that wears your face? That knows how you think? The camera came back. Elena stood in a corridor, staring into a cracked mirror. Her reflection looked normal, but her eyes never blinked. I don't know how many of us are left, she said. I don't know if anyone made it out. She leaned closer. They're not protecting us from Mars. They're protecting Mars from us? The recording ended. I sat there, staring at the frozen frame. Her eyes, still human, but already too still, looked back at me. The truth wasn't an accident. It wasn't a failure. NASA had known what Mars was, what it had been, and what it could become again. They'd seen the ruins. They'd found the bodies. And they'd gambled everything, every life in the colony, on the idea that they could control it. But the colony hadn't fallen. It hadn't been destroyed. It had been rebuilt, one piece at a time, one person at a time, until there was nothing human left. And now the signal was back. Not because it needed help, because it was ready. I didn't have time to think. The files were already copied, loaded onto multiple secure drives. The evidence, the schematics, the biological scans, the footage from Elena's logs, was ready to be sent. But as I prepared to upload, the system flagged an alert. Unauthorized network access detected. They'd found me. I yanked the cables, severing the connection. My screen flickered, overloaded by a flood of incoming requests. They weren't just watching, they were already inside. I switched to backups, booted secondary encryptions, rerouted through ghost servers. The files started uploading again, crawling toward completion, but the alerts kept coming. Access denied. Network compromised. Purge initiated. They were wiping the evidence. I grabbed my drives, shoved them into my bag, and ran. The streets outside felt narrower than before. Cameras tracked my movements. Drones hummed overhead, quiet but constant. My phone vibrated. Another incoming call from an unknown number. I let it ring. The files had to get out. I moved fast, cutting through alleys, switching trains, swapping routes. Every terminal I touched was blocked. Every connection flagged. I kept going. I found a public terminal, older, slower, but untraceable. I plugged in the drive and started the transfer. A warning flashed. Data breach detected. Connection closing. 70%. I forced a manual override. 80%. Security drones circled outside. I could see their lights through the glass. 90%. A man stepped off the train platform, too steady, too focused, eyes scanning every movement. 98%. I pulled the drive and ran. The upload was done. I didn't stay to watch the fallout. Within minutes, the files were mirrored across the net, rogue sites, whistleblower networks, encrypted forums. The footage spread faster than I could track. The world saw it. The ruins. The bodies. The biomorph. The response was immediate. Government channels went dark. News outlets issued denials, then corrections, then nothing at all. The networks went offline, replaced by emergency broadcasts, automated warnings, and scripted reassurances. Unverified content. Unauthorized data. Do not share. But it was too late. The footage kept spreading. Clips resurfaced, reshared, edited, and analyzed. Close-ups of distorted faces, hollow eyes, movements that mirrored human gestures but never quite matched. Satellite images leaked next. Blurry shots of the colony's surface, its structures collapsed, overtaken by growths that twisted outward in spirals. People began asking questions. What was Aegis? What was Project Genesis? And what was left of it now? The panic came quickly. Markets crashed. Protests erupted. Crowds gathered outside NASA's headquarters, demanding answers, demanding action. But the broadcasts didn't stop. More signals emerged, fragments from the colony, layered echoes of voices and static. Some sounded human, others didn't. And then came the final leak. A live feed. No one claimed responsibility for the stream. No one knew where it came from. But it was real. The feed showed the colony, what was left of it. The corridors were dark, lit only by emergency lights. Shadows moved through the halls, slow and deliberate. Some wore tattered uniforms. Some didn't wear anything at all. They weren't just biomorphs anymore. They were something else, something more. They looked human. But their movements were too smooth, too synchronized. They moved together, turning corners in unison, glancing toward the camera as though they could see it. And then one of them stepped closer. It reached out, pressed its hand against the lens. Its face looked familiar. Its eyes didn't blink. And its mouth opened, forming words. "We are still here." The feed cut out. I kept running. Agents followed. Corporate enforcers. Unmarked vehicles. I stayed ahead, but barely. They didn't want me dead. Not yet. They wanted the drives, the backups, the fragments of evidence I'd scattered across the net. They wanted to contain it. But it was already too late. The files were spreading faster than they could stop them. And the questions weren't going away. What was left of the colony? What was left of its people? And what was coming next? I didn't have answers. Not yet. But I had one last file. Elena's final message. The part 1 hadn't released. It was encrypted, deeper than the rest, locked behind codes I hadn't cracked. But it was there. And whatever it contained, whatever she left behind, it wasn't meant for them. It was meant for us. And I wasn't going to stop until I opened it. The world didn't move forward. It froze. Governments scrambled to contain the fallout. News anchors spoke in circles, their words carefully chosen, carefully empty. Experts flooded the airwaves with theories. Damage control disguised as explanation. But there were no answers. Only questions. Was Mars ever empty? Or had we stepped onto a planet that had already claimed its own? The footage replayed endlessly, dissected frame by frame. The ruins. The bodies. The corridors filled with shadows. And the faces. Human faces. Or something close enough to fool the eye, staring back through flickering screens, unblinking. Protests spread. Cities locked down. Supply chains broke. The world felt smaller, suffocated by uncertainty. And still, the signals kept coming. The static whispers. The fragmented words. The echoes that sounded too human to ignore. Governments called for calm. Corporations issued statements, distancing themselves from Project Genesis, from Mars, from the colony. But no one believed them. And no one could look away. I listened to it all, from safe houses, from abandoned rooms, always moving, always watching. The agents hadn't stopped. Neither had I. The files were out. The truth was out. But it wasn't enough. Because it wasn't over. I thought about Elena's words, her final warning. They're not protecting us from Mars. They're protecting Mars from us? But maybe that wasn't the full truth. Maybe it wasn't just about Mars. Maybe it was about something more. I played her last encrypted file over and over, running every code I had, breaking through layer after layer until it opened. The feed was dark at first. No video. Just sound. Elena's voice. "This isn't an ending," she said. "It's a beginning." The feed shifted. Static gave way to shapes, faint at first, then clearer, an image of the colony, but not as it had been. It was alive. Structures overgrown with organic material, twisting, connecting, breathing. Lights pulsing through corridors, no longer artificial. They glowed from within, alive and aware. And there were figures, moving through the halls, working, building. Not just biomorphs, not just echoes. They were creations. Something new, something formed from what we had left behind. And one of them turned toward the camera. It was Elena. Her voice returned, but this time it wasn't a recording. It was live. "We thought we could shape this world," she said. We thought we could control it, but evolution doesn't stop. She stepped closer. We gave it what it needed: tools, designs, patterns, and it gave us something in return. Her eyes, too bright, too focused, locked on the lens. We were wrong to fear it, wrong to fight it. The colony was only the first step. The screen flickered. Her voice came again, echoing through every device, every channel. We are coming home. And then the signal cut. No static, no noise, just silence. But the damage was done. The world changed in that moment. The panic broke into chaos. Governments sealed borders. Satellites pointed toward Mars stopped transmitting. Earth turned inward, closing itself off, as though distance could stop what was coming. It wouldn't. I knew that. We all knew that. We had crossed a line the moment we touched Mars, woken something that couldn't be put back to sleep. We weren't the first to shape the planet, and we wouldn't be the last. We hadn't colonized Mars. Mars had colonized us, and it wasn't finished. The screens stayed dark, but the signals never stopped. Even after the networks shut down. Even after the broadcasts were blocked. The messages kept coming, repeating the same words. We are coming home. And this time, no one could stop them.